Vienna, 1907. Just as the imperial waltz echoed through Hofburg's marble halls and the chandeliers flickered above 1,000 pearls and polished boots. The laughter started the moment he stepped onto the ballroom floor. Yulian Reddin stood stiff in his ill-fitting uniform of the Imperial Telegraph Corps. His boots were polished, but the wrong shade of black. His trousers, though pressed, sagged slightly at the knees. Around him swirled the finest youth of the Habsburg Empire archdukes, barons, and Prussian visitors with perfect posture and family crests stitched in gold thread. Yulian had none of that. He had a borrowed jacket, a regulation haircut, and a letter signed by the Empress herself, an invitation extended not to him, but to his father, who had died stringing wires through Bosnia. Across the room, they whispered behind fans and monocles. "Who's the scarecrow? Some provincial. Probably can't tell a cotillion from a cravat. God help whichever poor girl gets stuck with him." And then Princess Adelheid Zeller turned. She was not the most beautiful woman in the room, but she was the one who made it tilt. Her gown was a soft cream, embroidered with alpine edelweiss. Her gloves reached past her elbows. Her hair, pinned in a crown of honey-blonde braids, trembled slightly as she stepped forward. Her eyes, a shade too direct for court, narrowed as she looked at Yulian. He met her gaze. He didn't flinch. "Will you dance with me?" she asked, her gloved hand extended. The room went silent. Yulian blinked. "Your Highness, I didn't ask for your rank," she said. "I asked for your hand." He took it, and the orchestra, sensing a scene, began again. They moved awkwardly at first. His steps were too sharp, hers too practiced. But halfway through the waltz, something shifted. She slowed, and he matched her. The music carried them, and the whispers around them faded. "You don't belong here," she said quietly. "I know. Then why did you come?" "My father died believing this empire owed him something. I came to collect." She smiled not cruelly, but like someone who recognized a fellow prisoner. "I see." He dipped her. She didn't look away. Afterward, as he led her from the floor, the crowd parted with exaggerated civility. No one spoke, but the contempt in their eyes was loud. Behind the curtain of marble and silk, Adelheid tugged him into a narrow corridor lined with statues of dead emperors. "You're braver than they know," she said. "I'm not sure if that's bravery or stupidity. Maybe both. I prefer that." From down the hall, her lady-in-waiting called, "Your Highness, the Archduke expects the next dance." Adelheid looked at Yulian. "Meet me again. Tomorrow. The Belvedere Gardens. 5 o'clock sharp. Come in uniform." He hesitated. "They'll talk. They already do. Let them choke on it." She turned and left, her skirts whispering secrets against the marble floor. The next day, he arrived 10 minutes early. The upper gardens were empty, save for the stone lions and the trimmed hedges. He stood at attention beside a rose bush, hands behind his back, the sun hot on his shoulders. She came, not in court dress, but a walking gown of pale blue, a hat pinned low over her brow. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. "I didn't think you'd remember." They walked without speaking at first. The gravel crunching beneath their feet was the only sound. At the edge of the reflecting pool, she stopped. "My mother arranged a match with a Bavarian prince," she said. "He has a jaw like a shovel and a mind like cabbage soup." Yulian raised an eyebrow. "Why tell me?" "Because I told her no." "That doesn't seem allowed." It wasn't. She knelt and plucked a blossom from a fallen branch. "They say I'm foolish, that I'll die alone in a castle with cats. And you? I'd rather live once and love hard than smile politely for 50 years. He didn't answer. She stood, brushed her skirts. "I know what they said about you last night," she added. "The laughter, the snide looks. I've heard worse in the barracks. Still, they mocked my bride." He blinked. "What?" She turned toward him fully. "I've decided. You can't just." "I can. I will." "Adelheid." She stepped close, her gloved hand brushing his. "They'll never allow it. Not without scandal. Not without a fight." He looked down at her fingers against his. "Then we fight." A sharp voice interrupted them. "Your Highness." It was Countess von Hallenberg, Adelheid's governess since childhood. She stood at the far end of the path, arms crossed, eyes cold. "You are expected at the Hofburg. Now." Adelheid inhaled, then looked at Yulian. "Tomorrow. Same time." He nodded. They met again. And again. A week passed, then two. Each meeting risked everything. They spoke in whispers. He tucked notes into the folds of her parasol. She passed him books with pressed violets between the pages. Once, in the shadow of a marble cherub, she kissed him soft and quick, like a stolen breath. But the city watched, and the court whispered louder. One morning, as Yulian stood in his quarters in the Telegraph Corps barracks, a courier arrived. A sealed summons. The Empress herself. He dressed in his best, polished every button, shaved twice. When he arrived at Schönbrunn Palace, the guards didn't salute. Inside the Hall of Mirrors, he stood alone until the Empress entered. She was older than he'd imagined, smaller, but her eyes were sharp as bayonets. "You dance well," she said. Yulian bowed. "Thank you, Your Majesty. You've made quite the impression. I didn't intend." "You didn't intend to seduce my granddaughter?" He stiffened. "No, Your Majesty." "Then explain why she refuses the Archduke of Bavaria, but writes poetry about a telegraph boy." Silence. "She says she loves you." He said nothing. "You will leave Vienna," the Empress said. "Tonight. There will be no charges, no dishonor, but you will not see her again." Then she turned and left. That night, Yulian packed his bag. He stared at the uniform he'd worn with such pride. Then he tore the insignia from the collar, folded it, and placed it in his breast pocket. But before he could leave, there was a knock at his door. It was Adelheid. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair loose under her riding cloak. "I'm not letting you go," she said. "They'll ruin you." "Then let them try." She stepped inside, closed the door. "They mocked my bride," she whispered, "until they saw how the princess loved him." He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "We're running," she said. "Tonight. I've arranged it all. You and me. Hungary first, then France if we must." He stared at her. "You'd give up everything?" She smiled. "Not everything. Just the things I never wanted." He kissed her then fully, finally, no longer in secret. And outside, the city's lights flickered on, one by one, unaware that somewhere in its heart, a love had just begun to burn too bright to be hidden. The train that carried them out of Vienna steamed through the dark like a secret. Adelheid sat beside Yulian in a second-class carriage, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the window where the silhouettes of pine trees passed in hurried procession. She wore no jewels, only a wool traveling coat and a hat pulled low, her royal bearing softened into anonymity. They said little as the train wound through Lower Austria. Words felt fragile. Instead, she leaned her shoulder gently against his, and he let his hand rest near hers, not quite touching. When the conductor passed, she handed over 2 tickets printed under false names, her and Frau Berger, newlyweds from Linz. By morning, they arrived in Schönbrunn. A thick mist clung to the cobblestones, and the bells of St. Michael's told the hour as they stepped into the quiet Hungarian town. Yulian carried their single valise, and Adelheid kept her head down beneath her veil. No one paid them any mind. They rented a small room above a cooper's shop, the ceilings low and the windows drafty. The landlady, a widow with few questions, offered them bread and plum jam. Adelheid thanked her and practiced Hungarian, careful not to let her Viennese accent slip through. Inside their room, Yulian lit the stove while Adelheid unpinned her hair. It fell across her shoulders in soft waves, no longer bound in the careful braids of court. She crossed to where he stood, paused, then placed her hand over his heart. "This is the first day I haven't worn a title," she said. He touched her wrist lightly. "You don't need one." Outside, a cart rumbled past. She closed her eyes. "I dreamed last night they caught us," she murmured. "That I was dragged back to Vienna in chains of ribbon and lace." He looked at her, careful with his voice. "I'd come for you." She opened her eyes. "Even if it meant facing the Empress again, I'd face the whole empire." By the week's end, they found work. Yulian, with his training, was taken on as a telegraph technician by the Schönbrunn postmaster, a broad-shouldered man with ink-stained fingertips and little interest in anyone's history. Adelheid, under the name Anna, gave piano lessons to merchant daughters in the afternoons. She played with precision, her touch always delicate, but never cold. Each evening, they walked along the Rakotsi promenade, where the scent of chimney smoke mingled with the bitterness of early winter. Once, she bought roasted chestnuts from a Romani girl and tucked one into Yulian's coat pocket without a word. He found it hours later, still warm. In their room, they shared a narrow bed. She slept facing him, her hand resting against his chest, her breath steady. He woke before dawn, always, to watch her sleep in the pale hush before the city stirred. One Sunday, as they crossed the market square, a familiar voice cut through the crowd. Princess Adelheid. She froze. A man stood by the fountain, older, with a silk cravat and a silver-topped cane. His mustache was immaculately trimmed, and his boots shined like mirrors. Yulian recognized him from the Hofburg, the Baron von Weissenfels, one of the Empress's envoys. "You should not be here," the Baron said. "You've caused a storm." Adelheid stepped forward. "That storm is mine, not yours. Your grandmother demands your return. She demanded I marry a man I do not love. She offered you protection, position, legacy, and I chose the only thing she never gave me." The Baron's eyes flicked to Yulian. "This? You gave up a kingdom for this." Yulian remained silent, spine straight. He would not shrink. "Not here." Adelheid's voice stayed calm. "Not for him. With him. There's a difference." The Baron's face reddened. "You will regret this." She stepped closer. "I already regret every day I spent living as if I were someone else." He shook his head and turned away. That night, as snow began to fall, Yulian sat at the table writing a letter to his mother in grass. Adelheid stood at the window, the candlelight catching the curve of her cheek. "They'll never bless this," she said softly. "We don't need their blessing," he answered. "But we'll need something." He looked up. "What?" "A place to belong." He folded the letter. "Then we'll build it." She turned, walked to him, and rested her forehead against his. "I want to marry you. Properly. No lies. No disguises." Yulian's voice caught. "You take my name? I've already taken your life into mine." They married a fortnight later in the chapel of a fated monastery just outside Sopron. The priest, ignorant of her true lineage, performed the rites with quiet reverence. Adelheid wore a simple cream dress, borrowed from the cooper's wife. Yulian wore his uniform jacket, now plain, its insignia gone but his pride intact. When the priest said, "You may kiss the bride," Yulian did so, gently, without ceremony. The wind outside stirred the chapel trees. In the months that followed, they became known, if not well known. Her and Frau Berger were spoken of kindly by neighbors. She for her grace, he for his steadfastness. They were poor, but not pitted. The butcher saved a better cut for them. The dressmaker's daughter brought them lilacs in spring. No one in Sopron knew the truth, or if they did, they chose not to speak it. But word traveled slowly, and change slower still. One morning, as Yulian repaired a wire on the outskirts of town, a carriage arrived at the cooper's shop. Inside sat a woman in mourning black, her veil heavy, her poise unmistakable. Adelheid opened the door herself. The Empress stepped inside. The door closed behind the Empress with a sound like a sealed fate. The room, a simple upstairs chamber with a warped window pane and a stove that clicked when it cooled, held its breath. Adelheid stood without moving, her hands at her sides, the hem of her linen skirt brushing her ankles. The Empress removed her gloves slowly, her rings catching the light. She did not sit. "You've chosen exile," she said. "And yet you receive me without fear." "I no longer belong to your court," Adelheid answered. "But I was raised to receive guests with dignity." The Empress studied the room. Her eyes moved over the rough-hewn table, the lamp with its cracked glass, the faint scent of coal and linden soap. "Dignity," she repeated, an admirable word, often mistaken for defiance. Adelheid didn't look away. "I've mistaken far worse for affection." The Empress stepped nearer, the silk of her mourning dress whispering over the floorboards. Her face, though lined, still held the clarity of youth in the set of her jaw. "You were born to lead, to guide nations, not to stitch hems and barter for bread." "I've guided myself," Adelheid said, "and I've never felt more certain of my steps." "There is certainty," the Empress replied, "and then there is consequence. You left without sanction. You defied your station. You embarrassed the house of Zeller." Adelheid's voice didn't rise. "You taught me that the house was built on sacrifice. I made mine." The Empress's gaze narrowed. "And him?" "He made his quietly, without complaint. He never asked me to choose." Below, a cart rattled down the street. A dog barked twice, then fell silent. The Empress turned to the window. "I remember when you were 6, and you refused to wear shoes at your own name day. You said you wanted to feel the marble with your toes because it was honest. Adelheid didn't smile, and you had me confined for a week. I wanted to teach you that honesty must be earned. I've earned mine. The Empress turned back. Her voice was softer now, though it held no warmth. Do you imagine that love will shelter you when borders shift? When the coffers run dry? When the name you gave up becomes the name your children can no longer claim? Adelheid stepped forward. I don't imagine anything. I rise each morning beside the man who repairs broken wires with his hands, who knows the weight of silence and the cost of truth. That is not imagination. That is a life. The Empress's eyes flicked to her granddaughter's wedding band, thin and unadorned. You would trade a throne for this? I did, and I would again. The silence stretched. The candle on the table sagged in its brass holder, wax pooling beside a folded linen cloth. At last, the Empress reached into her satchel and withdrew a velvet pouch. She placed it on the table. Your uncle's estate in Bohemia lies untended. The tenants have sent letters. They need a steward. She paused. I cannot reinstate your title, but I can offer land. And silence. Adelheid stared at the pouch. Why? Because I have known love, the Empress said, and I know what it costs. Yulian returned 2 hours later, his boots dusted with frost, his collar turned up against the wind. When he stepped inside, he saw the pouch unopened on the table and Adelheid seated beside it, her posture still. She came, he said. Adelheid nodded. He hung his coat and crossed to her. Will they come for us again? No, she said. But they're watching, and they will keep watching. He took her hand. We'll outlast them. She looked up at him then, her eyes clear. She offered us a farm. He raised his brows. A farm? In Bohemia. Untended. Forgotten. He sat beside her. Do you want it? I want a place where we aren't hiding. He reached for the pouch and opened it. Inside were keys, a deed, and a ring ruby set in gold, a crest engraved along the band. She left it, Adelheid said. She didn't ask me to wear it. He held it up to the light. She gave you a choice. She gave us a beginning. They left Chopron at the end of March, as the frost began to melt in the fields and the riverbanks softened with thaw. The journey was long, but they traveled with ease. No longer in disguise, but not yet announced. At each stop, they carried only one trunk and a basket of bread wrapped in linen. The estate lay nestled in the foothills, surrounded by beech groves and grazing sheep. The manor was weathered but whole, its shutters faded, its hearth cold. The tenants greeted them with wary nods and cautious hands, uncertain who they were or what they meant to bring. Yulian began repairs at once. He rebuilt the apiary, cleared the old orchard, rewired the barn. Adelheid met with every family in the village, listened before she spoke, and answered each question with quiet clarity. By midsummer, the fields rippled with barley, and the manor's roof no longer leaked. On the feast of Saint Anne, the villagers gathered in the chapel for Mass. Adelheid entered last, her hand in Yulian's, wearing the ruby ring not as a symbol of rank, but of chosen belonging. The pews fell silent as they passed. After the final hymn, the elder of the village approached her with a wreath of woven cornflowers. He bowed, not deeply, but with sincerity, and placed it on her head. We mocked you, he said, because we thought a princess would never carry water, never kneel in the dust. Adelheid looked to Yulian, then back to the elder. And now, he smiled, toothless and wide. Now we see how a woman loves, and what a man becomes when she does. She bowed in return. Behind her, Yulian stood with his hands folded, the sun catching the edge of his collar. They stepped outside into the light together, no longer washed with suspicion. They were seen, and they were no longer mocked. The first frost came early that year, settling over the Bohemian hills in a hush of silver. Smoke curled steadily from the manor chimney, and the orchard, now trimmed and orderly, bore only the last stubborn apples. Villagers passed the gates more often now, not with questions but with greetings, some bringing eggs, others with bolts of cloth or jars of preserved quince. Inside the house, the library had become a study. Shelves once filled with theological commentaries were now lined with agricultural ledgers and correspondence from nearby estates. Yulian sat at the desk, a map open before him, the ink still drying on a letter addressed to the regional magistrate. Adelheid stood by the window, watching two village girls chase a wayward goose along the path. "They've started calling me Pawnee," she said, her voice low with a kind of amused surprise. Yulian looked up. "It suits you. I never thought I'd answer to anything but Highness." He folded the letter. "Titles are only useful until they get in the way." She turned from the window. "There's talk of a school being built past the mill." The elder asked if I'd teach the girls to read. He rose and crossed to her. "Would you?" "I think I'd like to. Their hands are calloused, but they're curious." "That's more than I can say for most of my tutors." He paused, then lifted her hand, examining the soft mark left by her garden shears. "You've changed. I've become who I am." They walked the orchard after supper, the air brittle with cold, the sky streaked with the last violet of twilight. Adelheid picked a wind-fallen apple and turned it in her hand. "I've been dreaming," she said, "of marble floors again. But this time I'm barefoot by choice." He didn't answer. Instead, he stopped and looked toward the village, where lanterns blinked on one by one. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated. "There's talk in Vienna. A delegation may come, not to reclaim you, but to observe." "Observe what?" "Us. This estate. What you've made of it." She let out a slow breath. "Then they'll see what happens when a crown is traded for soil and good work. They may not come kindly. They needn't." A week later, they arrived. 3 carriages, lacquered and sober, with black-coated men and one familiar figure stepping out last. Countess von Hollenberg, older now, but with the same rigid spine and pursed lips. Adelheid met them in the courtyard, not in silk, but in a dark wool dress and a cloak lined with fur. Yulian stood beside her, a pin still tucked behind his ear from the morning's accounts. The Countess said nothing at first, only scanned the grounds, the repaired roofline, the freshly painted shutters, the workers in the field who paused only briefly before returning to their tasks. "You receive us without ceremony," she finally said. "I no longer have use for ceremony," Adelheid replied. "Neither does the Empire, it seems." The Countess motioned toward the others, who murmured among themselves in cautious Latin. They were told this place had fallen into disrepair, that the princess had vanished into madness or scandal. Adelheid's gaze didn't waver. "And what do they find instead?" The Countess studied her. "A woman in boots, a man without rank, and an estate that thrives." Yulian shifted slightly, but said nothing. "You were mocked," the Countess murmured, more to herself than to them. "Relatives wagered how long it would last. Ministers said it was a phase. But you've made something enduring." Adelheid's voice was quiet. "I loved him when it cost me everything. And I love him still, now that it gives me back more than I'd thought I lost." The men behind the Countess fell silent. Later, after the carriages departed, leaving behind only the faint tracks of wheels in the frost, Adelheid sat beside Yulian on the stone bench near the well. The sky was clear. A thin crescent moon hung low over the fields. "They saw," she said. "They did. Do you think they believed it?" He looked at her, a faint smile in his eyes. "They will. When they remember what they saw in your face." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "What did they see?" He rested his cheek against her hair. "A woman who was never theirs to mock." The wind moved through the orchard trees, and somewhere in the distance, the chapel bell rang once. They didn't speak again that night. There was nothing left to say. They had built something no decree could undo, no sneer could diminish. And the world, finally, had begun to understand what love could build when it was brave enough to ignore the sound of laughter behind closed fans. The village slept. The manor stood, and in the quiet warmth of their shared life, no one mocked his bride again.